Years ago, I noticed something a little bit odd when I looked at the Wikipedia page for Bethesda. I noticed the studio only had 180 listed employees, which seemed weird, because I remember reading about how the main Ubisoft office had 3,000 people, almost, in the late Xbox 360 era. And the EA Vancouver studio that doesn't really do much outside of the yearly sports games and a minor support role in Star Wars Battlefront 2, claimed 1,300 employees in 2013. I know both these make more games than Bethesda does, but they're a lot less unique than the kind of distinct, big-scale, open-world games that Bethesda usually makes, which obviously take a lot more resources and just pure man-hours to make than things like the yearly sports game. Then I noticed that 180 number didn't even include a relatively new support studio in Montreal that wasn't even around for the Skyrim or Fallout years. Eventually I realized that this kind of explains a lot of the issues I've had with Bethesda games over the years, since it isn't really much of a surprise that a team with, in some cases, a tenth the developers of other studios have access to, would release unpolished games with a ton of technical issues. I've seen people blame Bethesda's main engine for a lot of the problems, but that always seemed like a symptom instead of the root cause of what's been going on at the studio. Like, there's been plenty of game engines that have had a ton of just steady iteration over the years, but of course, a studio that doesn't really have that much actual manpower would struggle to do something like that, which would require a ton of just constant maintenance and just careful updating. I know there's been debate about studios or dev teams being unnecessarily large, but the kind of big, detailed open world games that Bethesda makes just kind of straight up need a large amount of manpower to make. If they're going to be good, they just need to be filled with things like interesting characters and locations or creatures or whatever. But how did this happen though? The studio's had a ton of commercial success with its games, like Fallout 3, Oblivion, Skyrim, Fallout 4, plus all of the DLC. But of course, they didn't actually really keep that money. That went to Zenimax, and looking through their history recently, it isn't really much of a surprise where it all went. First, they founded a new studio to develop Elder Scrolls Online in 2007, right after Oblivion. Then, after Fallout 3 launched, and its 5 DLC packs, they bought id Software, then Arcane, then Machine Games, then Tango. And the crazy thing is, they actually gave the studio making Elder Scrolls Online more employees than the main Bethesda studio. So they were giving the MMO spin-off more resources in terms of manpower than the actual studio making the games that made people care about those series in the first place. You look at all these acquisitions, plus the E3 presentations they started doing, and it's pretty obvious what happened. They wanted to spend their way in becoming a major publisher instead of just investing in the studio that actually made them the money in the first place. And the thing is, it kind of looks like FromSoftware has been on a similar path over the last few years, and I feel like I haven't really heard much people talking about a lot of the strange choices they've made. Like, originally I thought FromSoftware was kind of just an independent studio, but that kind of isn't really the case. It's kind of a similar thing to what Bethesda had with Zenimax. They're owned by Kadokawa Group, which is a holding company that has a bunch of different assets, so it's not really the same thing as a kind of traditional publisher like EA or Activision Blizzard. It's kind of unclear exactly how the relationship works, but it kind of seems that FromSoftware has more freedom to do what it wants. We know at least that they were actually allowed to grow to around 400 employees as they started making more games, and the games they were making were becoming increasingly larger scale, like Elden Ring. But in 2022, some weird things started happening. In August that year, FromSoftware announced that they were issuing new shares to Sony and Tencent. That would mean Kadokawa Group would only control just under 70% of the studio. The press release says that they were using this money to invest in IP development and publishing capabilities, which makes sense because essentially they've been having to just give up a decent amount of their money to companies like Bandai Namco for publishing. But why did they get funding like this? They just had a massive release with Elden Ring. So what happened to the money from that they instead decided to devalue their share in what's arguably the hottest game studio in the world right now? The only reason I can think of is that Kadokawa thinks that money is better spent elsewhere, so losing out on future revenue of growth from FromSoftware isn't a big deal. Which isn't super unreasonable if you think about the deal in terms of just selling high when the value is inflated from Elden Ring's success, but that kind of doesn't really make sense the more you think about it. Like, this deal was happening basically as the kind of value of video game and tech in general was plummeting from like where it was a year prior. Like there was still the success of Elden Ring and its money from that factoring into things, but you kind of can't ignore like the broader market and the impact that that has, with the very clear message that these type of game studios just aren't worth what they were a year ago.
And this was also like 2.5 months only before those meta layoffs kind of started the mass firings in tech, to kind of really just show how things were kind of deteriorating in that sector in this year.
Plus, it's worth noting that that success followed the first 3-year gap between game releases in their history.
So when you're actually thinking of the value of FromSoftware immediately after Elden Ring's release compared to the kind of near future value,
you kind of have to take into consideration the fact that they basically had 2 years of no revenue prior to that, outside of just the small stream of digital sales of old games. Like, it isn't really a situation of judging FromSoftware's future in terms of, is the next Soulsborne game or whatever going to make as much as Elden Ring. It's more about just that period of time. So is that Soulsborne game plus Armored Core plus any DLC for that plus the Elden Ring DLC going to make more money than Elden Ring? Which doesn't really seem so unlikely that you just get rid of 30% of your share in the company.
But then some other weird news kind of kept coming out of FromSoftware. Like there was that report about how the employees were kind of being underpaid relative to other games companies and below like the living wage for Tokyo. And then also they were paying only half wage for overtime when the industry norm is to pay over the normal amount. I always found it weird that this was kind of glossed over when it happened, because this seemed like it was a pretty big part of what's been going on with like Blizzard. They underpaid people and just sort of took a risk that they would just try to get better jobs elsewhere after getting the experience at Blizzard, plus that name on their resume. So now FromSoftware seems like they're doing the same thing in an environment where a lot of other companies in Japan are giving pretty big raises. So I wouldn't be shocked if like some FromSoftware people are kind of just dusting off their resumes and sending them off too, like a lot of people do with Blizzard. And, if I was a hiring manager at Capcom and someone came up to me with a resume that had like worked on Elden Ring of all things for like 4 years, then I would definitely rush to hire them.
Especially given how weird this situation's been with the Elden Ring DLC. I mean, it's been, a year and a half with basically zero information outside of that one JPEG they posted about it.
Like for perspective, Total War Warhammer 3 is a very different game, but it came out basically at the same time as Elden Ring, and it wasn't great. It had a lot of problems that needed a lot of patching even to get it into the not perfect state that it's in now. And then, with the first DLC, they added a big Immortal Empires game mode that just combined like the maps and the factions of the first 2 games for just one huge campaign. And then they had like a trailer for the second big DLC drop basically around the same time FromSoftware put out that tweet of like, yeah, the DLC is still in the works, but they just had like a JPEG, whereas Creative Assembly had the initial trailer, then a bunch of gameplay stuff happening a few weeks after that, and that launched fairly quickly after announcement. And then the third DLC is basically happening like right now as I'm making this video. And we still don't really know anything about this Elden Ring DLC. So I kind of have to wonder if the chance just didn't go in their favor, and yeah, they've been losing people that worked on Elden Ring or have been working on this project, and they have to waste a lot of time just getting new people caught up with all the development and just engine stuff related to Elden Ring before they can even really start working, and that's just delayed this development. And I know they just came out with a game that was, good with Armored Core, but that also kind of has its weird things too. Like, for example, they announced this, 7 years ago, and I'm not sure why a kind of just mech game with a not necessarily generic, but kind of normal, expected, just strict mission structure really took that long. Like, the third Dark Souls game had a 3-year-long development cycle, which was split with Bloodborne, obviously, but then also for a 9-month period, Dark Souls 2. So this was nowhere near, the only thing that they were working on, but it still took less than half the amount of time, with less employees. Like, it just seems like there's a situation where they aren't under-investing in FromSoftware to the extent that Zenimax did with Bethesda. Like I said, they're still allowing them to hire, but like they're nickel and diming with things like wages and overtime. And instead of just investing in them, they're just doing this weird thing with shares after making a ton of money with Elden Ring that kind of make it obvious that kadokawa just isn't really putting like the faith in FromSoftware to really just continue to grow, which is just like not a good attitude for FromSoftware if they want to continue making great games. To have just the people making your decision just seemingly not have faith. I mean, it's worth remembering, they're basically just repeating what Bethesda did, where they just like dropped that Elder Scrolls 6 like JPEG years ago with just this Elden Ring DLC JPEG thing. It's a very direct kind of comparison that they've opened up. And then there's also that like weird crime that like the CEO did, where he like tried to bribe the Tokyo Olympics for like advertising campaign. So he basically like bribed the Tokyo Olympics in order to be selected to give them money. And then also they're a holding company, so it's not even like an identifiable brand they're advertising, so I don't know what the point is in advertising at the Olympics. Like, I'm pretty sure like high-level investors don't choose what holding company to throw money at based off of sports advertising. It's very strange things happening there. I don't really know how much it had to do with actually like affecting FromSoftware as chairman. I think I said CEO before I meant chairman. But that is still a decision-influencing role to an extent. And it's hard to wonder how, the guy who's been in this role for this period where FromSoftware has been very good, getting replaced by somebody else might negatively impact the studio. Or who knows, it could just be fine. But still, there's kind of a lot of red flags floating around. Maybe not huge ones, but still ones that make me kind of concerned.